Sometimes politics is more than a game. This morning, we focus on matters of life and death. In Ukraine, British weapons are reportedly being fired in the war that's already cost tens of thousands of lives. Are we making ourselves a target for Russia's nukes? Here at home, MPs and ministers are divided about what could be the most important decision they'll ever make. Who should have the right to decide how a life should end? The Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, joins us for the government this morning. We'll talk about that assisted dying legislation, the threat from Vladimir Putin, and her no small task of getting millions of Britons back to work. The government found itself in a mess this week over whether Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested under an International Criminal Court warrant. We'll get the view from the Conservatives with Shadow Housing Secretary Kevin Hollinrake. That assisted dying legislation is likely to dominate at Westminster next week, with a vote due on Friday. Now that both the Justice and Health Secretaries are opposing it, we'll hear from the author of the proposals, the Labour MP introducing the bill, Kim Ledbetter. And Ireland go to the polls in just 5 days' time. Sky News is interviewing all three of those who could end up as Prime Minister there this coming week. We'll bring you the first, the current Taoiseach, Simon Harris. Plus, with us throughout the show, former Work and Pension Secretary and BBC Director James Purnell, former Northern Ireland Minister and leading Brexiteer Steve Baker, and former Lib Dem leader Joe Swinson. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. There are two moments in our lives common to every human being, our birth and our death. They also happen to be the two moments over which we have least control. Other people, our parents mostly, decide when and where and how we come into the world. Few of us get the chance to choose when we leave it. But for a small number of people, death may be sought after as a blessed relief from acute physical pain or mental torment. The MP Kim Ledbetter will this week introduce a bill to Parliament that aims to offer some measure of choice for such individuals. The bill has divided MPs and peers. Indeed, this morning, the Cabinet Minister with the responsibility for enforcing the law published an eloquent rebuttal, writing of a slippery slope to death on demand. But she may be swimming against the tide. The most recent opinion survey, released today, says that the principle of the bill would be backed by 2/3 of the public. Both Ledbetter's supporters and her critics agree on one thing, though, that her bill, if passed into law, would profoundly alter the way our society thinks and talks about our final moment. Because at root, the view you take depends on the answer to two questions. What does it mean to be human? Should each of us be the absolute master or mistress of our own fate? And who gets to decide that? Let's start this morning by hearing from the government. A little earlier, I spoke to the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall. Liz Kendall, the Ledbetter bill on assisted dying comes into the Commons this week. How will you vote?
Well, you know, Trevor, that this is a free vote. The government doesn't have a position on this, but my views are on record. I voted for the bill the last time it was debated, and I'll be voting for it again. I think the safeguards in the bill are much stronger than last time, and I've always believed in giving people as much power, control and choice over the things that matter to them as possible, and that's the reason I'll be voting for the bill.
You say government hasn't got a position, but given that the two cabinet ministers who would actually be responsible for putting the legislation into effect, Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting, are publicly opposed to it, how does that make sense of the government's position being neutral?
So, look, I understand, and to your viewers, this will sound what's going on, but it is a free vote, so the government doesn't have a for or against position. Individuals...
And your boss said that you lot shouldn't be speaking about it at all, really.
It's It's quite difficult because we do have our own views. Many of us are on record, and obviously we have to reply to our own constituents about how we're going to vote. But let me just say this, not about the bill, but more broadly. I think it is really important that we as a society talk about what makes for a good death. And it might sound a funny thing for a politician to talk about, but, you know, in today's day and age, the sort of sudden deaths aren't as common, thank goodness, because of medical advances. So more and more of us are seeing families and friends die over a longer period. And I think it's really important that within our families and as a country, we talk about that, because I think a good death will be different for different people. We will all have our own views about that. And that, I think, would be a positive thing for the country to
I understand
discuss.
that, and I understand that's your motivation. But if I can just take you back to, I'm afraid, the raw politics of this. Both Les Treating and Shabana Mahmood have expressed their views strongly and eloquently. How is it possible that if the bill succeeds, that they can keep their jobs?
Because this is about the legislation that Parliament may or may not pass. Let's see what happens on Friday. But what I think is, I know you're going to try and get me into... I'm not going to criticise either Wes or Shabana, who are good colleagues and have strong opinions about this.
But they've expressed they've expressed opinions which most people say would make it impossible for them credibly
to implement
I
think you should maybe...
Surely it must be some mistake for both of them to be saying what they're saying.
I think you should ask them about that, not me. I'm not going to criticise either of two really good colleagues who have their own opinions about this. Let me come back to the point I am trying to make here. I have for many years campaigned for more choice and control over the end of life. I used to work very closely when I was doing social care with some of the hospices to give people choice to die at home, because too many people were being stuck in hospital when what they really wanted was to be at home with good palliative care, surrounded by family and friends. And I remember at the time talking about this issue, and a really good friend of mine said to me, but have you talked to your parents about what they want, Liz? And I was ashamed that I hadn't. And it really made me think about how important this is as a country. And I know you'll focus on the politics. This is a politics show. But actually, this is about, for us, in our families, what we want, as more and more of us have longer deaths, to make that as good as possible, and what the role of government is in supporting that choice, because my choice of how I would like to die will be different from my mum, my dad and my partner or my brother.
OK, well, lastly, let me ask you about that then. If the bill, the private member's bill, should fall, will the government take up the challenge of crafting legislation that could get through the House?
Well, I'm not going to speculate.
Or do you think it should?
I don't know. I think that we are hearing from the head of the Crown Prosecution Service that there is already a difficulty, and that it's actually dangerous not having more clarity in the law. That is not for me to decide here and now. All I would say is, as we come up to the vote on Friday, and there's inevitable speculation about where the Cabinet stands, we need to think about the most important thing, which is the people who are going through this, and how we have this in a compassionate way, have a debate in a compassionate way, and as a country, start discussing what makes for a good death.
Can I turn to the situation in the Ukraine? Have British weapons been used to hit targets inside Russia?
The Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister, I think, have rightly said we won't get into operational debates or discussions. The only person that benefits is Vladimir Putin. But we will stand...
There are weapons. We pay our taxes for it. We've got some... We have a right to know something about it. Well, let me just ask you in a different way. Have we told the Ukrainians that they have permission to use the weapons we supply?
That is another way, Trevor, of asking what is, in essence, an operational question.
No, it's a matter of principle.
I am not
the
going
Americans
to get...
have been clear that
I'll tell you what principle...
The Americans have been clear that they have given the Ukrainians permissions. Have we done the same?
I'm not going to speak about that. Again, you'll have to ask the Defence Secretary or the Prime Minister, and I'm sure they will say the same thing. But you talk about principle here. And our principle is that we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. For as long as it takes.
Does that mean, actually, one of your colleagues said, I heard her on the radio, that we would continue to supply weaponry, £3 billion and counting this year, until war is no longer necessary?
We will continue with that support, not only the funding that you've said, and you'll have heard this week, that included support.
That's money coming out of your budget.
It is the country's money here, and we believe standing by Ukraine is right because we know what happens when you appease aggressors. They just keep coming back for more and more and more. And that is the principle by which we stand by Ukraine. We've now trained over 50,000 of their recruits too. That support will continue because it is not just only in their interest, but we believe that it is also in our interest to stand by Ukraine.
Mr. Putin alleges that we are now an active combatant in this war. And I see that your colleague Pat McFadden is going to say in a speech tomorrow that we are now vulnerable to Russian cyber attacks. Are we now in firing line?
Well, Pat McFadden is right to say that there is not only the open military war with Russia as the aggressor, but there is also a hidden cyber war, and that Russia will do everything in its power to destabilise not only within Ukraine, but amongst the NATO allies. So we have to be absolutely vigilant in that as a government, but also in businesses and wider society to protect against those cyber hacktivists.
Interesting. This is interesting. Formally, are we at a heightened state of readiness for this?
Well, we are laser-focused on this issue.
No, but there's a process here, isn't there, in which Whitehall's put on notice. There are levels of readiness. Are we at a heightened state of readiness because of this now?
We have for many months, certainly since we came into government, really focused on making sure we have all the protections we need, including cyber protections, because there is a threat from Russia, this hidden warfare, as well as the open military aggression. And Pat McFadden, right across government, and the National Cyber Security Council are doing all we can to make sure we keep that resilience.
All right, let's talk about your particular area of responsibility. Prime Minister says, and today we're not going to let people basically take the mick on benefits. And your press release says that people who can work should work with clear consequences for those who don't engage properly. What consequences?
Let me start with what our objective is here. We'll be publishing...
Briefly, but I want to get to the consequences.
You do, but this is about a deal here, providing responsibilities on the government to provide more opportunities to work, but also on people to take those opportunities up. We want more people in better paid jobs in every part of the country. That's better for their living standards, it's better for businesses who want to recruit, and it's vital to get our economy growing. But we need three major changes. We need to overhaul our job centres so they become a genuine jobs and career service. We need a new youth guarantee so every young person is earning or learning. And we need a real overhaul of what's happening locally to join up work, health and skills support in order to drive down economic inactivity. Look, Trevor, the key problem...
I get all of that, but because most governments... And in fact, I have a feeling that last time we spoke about this, you said something like this. What I'm really interested in is what are the consequences for people who don't engage with
Let me tell you about that for young people. We now have almost 1 million young people not in education, employment or training. That's almost 1 in 8, often driven by mental health problems, but also for young people lacking basic skills, particularly in parts of the country that have struggled economically since the 80s and 90s. So we will bring in a new youth guarantee with more apprenticeships for young people, more basic skills, more opportunities to work. And let me come on to this.
You keep describing the problem and also telling me about the great opportunities.
This is the solution.
What you're not telling me is what happens if somebody decides they don't want to take the opportunity.
Because the two go hand in hand. We will provide those opportunities for young people to be earning or learning, because it is a disaster for you if you don't have basic skills.
I'm hearing the carrot. I'm hearing the carrot.
In return,
I'm not hearing the stick.
If you let me finish, I will say it. So you will have to take that up. There will be conditions, because we think if you are out of work or lack basic skills when you're young, it can have lifelong consequences. So we will be looking at those requirements for young people who are currently economically inactive.
But you're still not telling me what happens if they say, like your requirements, like your opportunities, but actually I'm off to the chip shop. What
that is
are
not what,
the consequences?
Do you know what? That is such a false
I know what you're going to do here. Let's not dance around
it. The consequences, for people who regularly refuse to take that up,
what are the consequences that you set it down in black and white? There will be consequences. We've been talking about this for 5 minutes and you have not told me a single consequence.
That will be that if people repeatedly refuse to take up the training or work responsibilities, there will be sanctions on their benefits. And
the reason
why we believe this so strongly is that we believe in our responsibility to provide those new opportunities, which is what we will do. We will transform those opportunities, but young people will be required to take them up, just as they did in the late 1990s with the New Deal for young people and the late noughties with the Future Jobs Fund, because it is so damaging for young people not to have skills or not to be in work when they're young. It can have a lifelong consequence, and we do not want that future for our young people.
Well, let's actually go back to... this is... I'm very old, so I remember some of this. Let's go back to...
Me too, Trevor.
Nowhere near me. Let's go back to a quote from a Labour minister in 1997. Here he is. He says, "We've reached the limits of the public's willingness simply to fund an unreformed welfare system through ever higher taxes and spending." Now, since then, we've added about 50% to the bill per household. Totals 300 billion or thereabouts. How are you going to... What is your game-changing reform that's going to bring that bill down?
I'll tell you this. The overwhelming issue we face today is people out of work due to long-term health problems. And the major problem with our current system is it does not join up work and health support. We have almost record number of people, 2.8 million, out of work due to long-term sickness. And as I said, this very worrying growth in young people. So we have to do three main things. Number one, work to prevent those health problems in the first place, which is what Wes Streeting is doing. Secondly, we have to join up work, health and skills support. That is not happening at the moment. So we need a big overhaul, both of our job centres and what's happening locally. And thirdly, let me give you a good example of something which is, I think, inspirational, which is a programme run by the NHS, individual placement and support, where people who've got mental health problems are given employment advice to get work. And that is, the results of that are more people in work and less use of the NHS. You've got to bring that support together.
Nobody can doubt your desire to make things change and the ambition you set out.
Well, that's good,
but let's just look at the reality of what has happened before. There is Labour, 1997 to 2010. Tony Blair, 12 days. He said that the quote I showed you, 12 days after he was elected. Then look what happened, up to 11,000.
Half of that is... Trevor, half of that
Tories kept it level. Your projections are already saying it's going up.
Yeah, but that's the result
of really making.
Half of that is pensions. So can we just get some reality into this? Half of this spending is on pensions. Yeah, but you have to focus on what the issue is.
My point is,
well,
the record...
Is that the
you can tell me what you want to do, but the record says that Labour governments spend more.
Well, actually, the pink projections are a result of a failed Conservative plan. But I don't underestimate how hard this is.
They're in your numbers now. Rachel Reeves... Those are the numbers of Rachel Reeves accepted.
On what... Yes, because we've had 14 years of the Tories. But I do not doubt how hard this is. We are an older and also a sicker nation. It is there... But I believe that people with long-term health problems and a disability, many millions want to work. We have to break down the barriers to that happening, and we have to think of welfare reform not only as about benefits. Look, don't get me wrong, the benefit system can incentivise or disincentivise work, but there are many other things we need to do to get people back into work. I do not want an ever-increasing benefits bill spent on the costs of failure, people trapped out of work, terrible for their life chances, and paid for by the taxpayer. We need big reforms to make that happen. That will be tough.
Okay.
And I'm sure you'll have me back to discuss our success or failure in the months ahead.
We've got to stop this or else I get my P45. We will no doubt be talking about this again
We will,
again.
we will.
Liz Kendall, thank you so
Really
much for your
nice
time.
to be here.
Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by former Work and Pensions Secretary and BBC Director James Purnell, former Northern Ireland Minister and leading Brexiteer Steve Baker, and former Lib Dem leader Joe Swinson. I'm going to give you a chance to talk about the substance of the assisted dying thing towards the end, because I think you will all have experience and you'll all have your own views. But can we just start by talking about the politics of it? The Cabinet is divided, and there's really very striking words being used. While we've been on air, Charlie Faulkner, in fact, talking to one of my colleagues, Anna Jones, said, the former Lord Chancellor and Minister of Justice, said of Shabana Mahmood, same party, I think she's completely wrong in relation to that. She and I respect this. She has religious and spiritual reasons why she believes completely in the sanctity of life. I respect that religious belief, but I do not think it should be imposed on everybody else. This is getting, I don't want to say out of hand, but quite serious, isn't it?
It actually doesn't feel all that different from debates which happened on smoking, for example, on civil partnerships or gay marriage after I left Parliament. So I think the whole point of a free vote is people can have different views even within the Cabinet. If it goes through, then the Cabinet will come together, I believe, and respect the will of the House. So it does happen when you get sort of closer to the vote and emotions get a little bit higher. But the whole point of this is to give people the ability to express different opinions.
Joe, I think that I understand that completely, but I think it's a sort of the weight of language and the strength of feeling here.
Yeah, and I think obviously people do feel strongly about it. I mean, as you said at the top of the show, this is life or death, right? So people are bringing very emotional experiences to this, understandably. But I think it is really important to try to just have that respect for different points of view, right? That people are, everybody in this scenario is trying to weigh it up and go, what is the right way forward? And they will come to different views on that. And if people speak to their constituents about this, as I know obviously many MPs are doing, their constituents will have very different views on this. There will be so many different perspectives. And so just the best thing possible is to try to make sure that debate happens in as respectful a way as possible and just try to keep the heat out of it, because people are just trying to make what is a difficult decision. I mean, I'm sure for your viewers watching, some people will have very, very clear views that are, they have and they've always had, but many others will be sitting there going, goodness, I don't know which way I would vote if I was an MP on this. This isn't necessarily an easy decision. There's a lot of different elements to consider.
Steve, Charlie Faulkner essentially attributes Shabana Mahmood's view to a matter of faith. In her letter to constituents, she does say that she has a fundamental belief, but she also makes a point about that she doesn't really believe that safeguards are strong enough and so on and so forth. Yeah. I suppose sticking with the issue of how we conduct this debate, do you think everybody is, as it were, describing everybody else's position properly?
I always think it's a good idea not to describe somebody else's position if you can possibly avoid it, especially on a free vote issue like this. One should set out one's own position and let it speak for itself, and then when engaging in debate with others, try and stay on things which are objective. This is very emotive. I think, actually, Charlie Faulkner's wrong to put someone else's faith on the table. It's for her, it's for those of us of faith to do that. But I actually agree with him that when one believes in God, one shouldn't put that faith use that faith to enforce a view on other people. I've always believed that Christians, Muslims, Jews, whoever, should be able to justify their policy positions on secular grounds, on evidence and reason. I think that's extremely important in the society we have today. But that said, one of the reasons why these things are free votes is because people will have spiritual views. But we should, all of us, be able to conduct this debate in a way which is reasonable and doesn't require us to put someone else's faith on the table.
You've all been ministers, and one of the things that's peculiar about this, you quite rightly say, James, we've been here before, but the Prime Minister was pretty clear with everybody at the beginning of this: shut up. The government doesn't have a position, and therefore I expect senior government ministers not to come out in public. They've all ignored him, haven't they?
Well, Liz Kendall wasn't ignoring him. She was saying what, she answered your question pretty straightforwardly. But you have people with strong views. It's extremely hard if you're a constituency MP and you have people who have very strong views to not say anything back to them. And Shabana has done that in response to her constituents. So I guess that's the line that people are trying to tread here. Again, in those previous debates, people did express their views. I think it's one of those things which, frankly, is inevitable. If you have people who represent their constituents are going to want to know what they think.
Well, OK, Liz Kendall is the welfare minister, and I think she said something significant this morning, which is that there will be consequences, particularly for young people. What did you make of it, Joe? Do you think that actually there is a prospect of welfare reform, or is it words?
Well, I mean, it took you a while to get those words in the first place, I think.
I wasn't going to say that.
But, I mean, the thing that I was really struck by, I mean, she did a very good sort of analysis of part of the problem, right? There's lots of people who aren't working. Many of them are ill. I mean, long COVID is a big chunk of that. People who have been really suffering in the last few years. And she pointed out that for a lot of young people, there's massive mental health problems, and that's true. So, in a sense, before you sort of start thinking about sanctions, what about child and adolescent mental health services? I mean, anyone who's engaged with young people in their life who has come across a difficulty and they've tried to get a referral, they know how horrendous those waiting lists are. And so, absolutely fine to make that diagnosis, but that's the part of the puzzle that felt to me was missing from this analysis of what they're going to do.
Can I just say, I think the reason she didn't want to answer your question in that way is precisely because of this, because actually the conditionality, the sanctions, is not changing as part of this. What she was trying to say is that what Labour believes in is doing both the support and then you have the conditionality, but she was saying that the support has been eroded and they're putting it back, and that you now need a different kind of support because it's a very different challenge about health problems, and the way to deal with that is to bring all of those services together through mayors, stitching it up at the local level and designing it around the need of the person who has been out of work because of illness. So she knew that if she went there, instead of talking about what she is announcing, which is a really very different way of doing it than when I was Secretary of State, which is much more about devolution, we would be talking about the bit that isn't changing and which is frankly pretty similar to what happened in the past. So that's sometimes when you're Secretary of State, there is a reason for wanting to stick to what you are saying. Otherwise, you end up talking about what you want to talk about rather than what she wants to talk about.
OK, thousands would buy that. I wouldn't. But anyway, I'll come back.
I think really two things. First, it did give me a slight smile to hear her talking eventually about sanctions, because the Labour Party, while we were in power, and particularly while we were in coalition, made our lives absolutely miserable about sanctions, and now she's conceding that they're necessary. But the other point I'd really make is that there's two big problems with the welfare state. It doesn't work very well. We can't afford it. And one only has to look at the OBR projections, or indeed the charts you're bringing up, to see that it's extremely expensive. And I'm afraid in the medium term, perhaps the next 20 years, the welfare state's going to really struggle to meet the pledges that it's made. So the point that James made about having a welfare system which is shaped around the individual, can meet them where they are and lift them up and into work so they can have the dignity of independence. That's really important. We can unite around that. The problem I think we've got is we've all of us here on this panel have been engaged one way or another with about a 20-year exercise in trying to make that happen, and it hasn't happened very well. So we really need to really think from first principles about how welfare works and whether it's possible through the state to put in place rules which enable us to really get alongside a person where they are, because it hasn't been working for 20 years.
The one thing that does strike me, though, very briefly, is that this is a perpetual Labour problem, in a way, how to deal with this balance between sanctions and so on and so forth. I was struck by the fact that she said what she said, given that when you look at all the surveys, actually, it's Labour voters who are most irritated by the idea that people are swinging the lead.
Well, it's called the Labour Party. It's about work. And, you know, you want to get people into work because that is good for people in terms of their fulfilment, their families, their independence. The Labour Party and government always believed in support and conditionality, as you said, right back to the New Deal for young people.
All right. It is now 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Work and Pension Secretary has told this programme that the government doesn't have a position on assisted dying, despite both the Justice and Health Secretary openly opposing new legislation. Liz Kendall, eventually, as you said, also told us that young people will lose benefits if they refuse to be in work, training or education. There's plenty still to come this morning. Shortly, we'll hear from the Shadow Housing Secretary, Kevin Hollinrake. Plus, we'll be joined by the MP behind what could be the most controversial private member's bill of the debate. Kim Leadbeater explains why assisted dying should be legalised. And as Ireland heads to the polls on Friday, we'll have the start of the party leader interview series by our Ireland correspondent, David Levitt. Fine Gael leader and current Taoiseach, Simon Harris, is first. That's coming up later. Now, let's turn to the Conservatives. I was joined earlier by the Shadow Housing Secretary, Kevin Hollinrake. Kim Leadbeater's bill on assisted dying comes to the Commons this week. How will you vote?
I'll vote for it. I voted for it in 2015. I think the right checks and balances are there. Obviously, we're not oblivious to the concerns that people raise about things like coercion. But I think people should have the right to choose. You should have dominion over your body and your soul. And so I think it's really important that people are given that choice, both in Parliament, of course, the vote on Friday, but ultimately the decision for people to end their life in this way.
Your leader's expressed her doubts. Are Conservative MPs going to have a free vote?
Yes, as that's how I understand it. I think every parliamentarian will get a free vote on this. I think that's absolutely the right thing. I think people need to take into account about 600 people every year who are terminally ill take their own lives, their own hands, and that's a terrible decision for people to have to take. So this gives people that choice. So this is happening anyway, and people are going to Switzerland instead of being able to do this in the UK. So, yeah, I get all the arguments, the slippery slope arguments and all these kind of things, and we need the right checks and balances. I believe those checks and balances are there in this legislation. So, you know, two doctors overseeing this and a court overseeing this. So,
does it bother you that cabinet ministers have taken a public view on this? Because the convention is that on a free vote like this, the government shouldn't take a position.
It doesn't actually, because I think it's so important we have a proper debate about this, and you see that from all different perspectives. But the perspective I see it from is personal experience, to be honest, Trevor. I saw my mum pass away in very difficult circumstances, and I think that choice should have been there then. And I think other people should have that choice. And I don't think it's right that people are prevented from having that choice when people have a different view. That is my view, and I fully respect other people's view. But I think the most compelling argument is the slippery slope. Will this move down a certain way? But we've seen in other jurisdictions, Oregon, for example, has had these measures in place just for terminally ill people for 27 years, and that slippery slope situation has not happened.
All right. On the international scene, there's been an ICC ruling indicting Benjamin Netanyahu of various crimes. If Keir Starmer keeps to his word and obeys the ICC ruling, would you support a decision to arrest the Israeli PM if he came to London?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, we don't, for a number of reasons. Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute on this. Palestine is not a recognised state. We think this is the wrong move diplomatically as well as legally, so we wouldn't. And we think Labour Keir Starmer should definitely say that he's not going to participate in the ICC ruling. But
we are, as a state, we did sign the Rome Statute. We are a member of the ICC, like I think in 120 other countries. Do you think that we should leave the ICC?
No, I don't think that. But I do think we should be able to make a judgment.
But then, how can you be in a court and accept that a court is legitimate, but decide when you are going to accept its rulings or not?
Well, courts sometimes get things wrong. We should be able to have a view on those things, and I think we should have a view on this. I mean, what you're trying to make sure is we get to the best possible outcome, the release of the hostages and peace in Israel and Gaza. That's what everybody wants. So the best way to pursue that is through diplomatic routes rather than these kind of legal routes, which we think are not the right way forward. And I am also very concerned about some of the actions of Israel. Israel absolutely needs to do more to prevent the loss of life, but nevertheless, they're in a situation where to me, there's no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, and that's what the ICC are seeming to draw.
But this ICC point is quite important. I mean, either you're in a court and rule of law, Tories stand for that and so on, or you're not in it.
Well, I don't agree with that because, again, the reasons that I outlined earlier.
You don't agree with the rule of law?
The Rome Statute. Israel are not a signatory to that. Palestine is not a recognised state. So I think there are legal issues around that.
All right, let me just ask you about something in your own area of responsibility. Both Deputy Prime Minister, Housing Minister and the Prime Minister say that loosening planning laws are central to growth. Would you support any move to make the process easier by, for example, making local objections harder to mount?
Well, it depends what they mean by that. If they're removing democracy from the process, I don't agree with that. But I do agree with planning reforms, and I wish Angela Rayner well with those reforms. Clearly, the planning process is far too complex.
What reforms would make a difference, do you think, though?
Well, I think you need to...
Every government comes in and says we're going to reform planning.
Well, I think, actually, one of the things Labour said they'd do is put more resources into planning. It's often a resource thing as much as a reform thing. So resourcing is good. I'm not convinced those will bring the rewards that Angela Rayner thinks they will, but nevertheless, I do see planning reform as being important. But I have real concerns about some of the plans that Angela Rayner has on this, lowering the targets for urban areas, increasing massively the targets for rural areas, a threefold increase in target in my area, for example. So I'm very concerned about that. We had record levels of house building in the UK under our government between 2013 to 2023, record levels in the last 50 years. You can do this. I'm not sure Labour are on the right track to do it, but we'll watch with interest.
Your leader says that she's going to go slow on policy, focus on values and so on and so forth. But we have heard two very definite views about policy. One is that she says she would reverse VAT on school fees. The other is that she would reverse inheritance tax changes on farmers. It's interesting. Is the new Conservative battleground going to be to defend, essentially, the rural middle classes? It sounds very traditional Tories.
Well, I'll tell you what it should be there to defend aspiration. Paying to send your child to school, why would you tax that? People create businesses, not just farmers.
It's the 7% who can afford to pay.
Sorry?
You're taxing the 7% who can afford to pay fees.
Many people make sacrifices to send their children to public school. And, of course, the taxes they pay in their general life send other people's children to school. Why should they be taxed on that? But it's aspiration. It's not just that. It's about starting a business, the taxes on business, which they said they would never apply. But all those broken promises. Do you remember the fully costed, fully funded manifesto? All those broken promises. £40 billion of tax increases. That's what we're seeing from this government.
But let me come back to the question I asked you, because you want to defend, help people who want to send their children to private schools. You want to defend farmers who have got £1 million in assets. It sounds really, let me put it this way, that actually this sounds like the old Tories who defend moneyed interests and the rich.
This is about aspiration and growth. You remember the Labour government set out for growth. When they inherited our economy, it was the first quarter this year, 0.7% growth. The second quarter, 0.5% growth. This quarter, 0.1% growth. What do you think drives growth in our economy? It is businesses that drive growth. It is not governments. Those farmers, you're talking about, I've got to talk to you about this £1 billion, because I have a farm in my constituency, mid-sized farm, these people just about break even, 350 acres, they're facing a £500,000 bill to pay their inheritance tax. That's 12 years of profits. Don't tell me these people are millionaires rolling in money, they can pay this money. It'll destroy family farming in this country.
Kevin Hollerich, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Trevor.
Back to our panel now. James Purnell, Steve Baker and Joe Swinson. Steve, this ICC ruling, it's a tricky thing for the government. Keir Starmer's said very clearly, we are a member of the ICC, we signed up to the Statute of Rome, and we're obliged to follow its rulings. If you had been a minister, would you be sending the cops to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu?
I would not be sending the cops, no, but I think it indicates a very serious problem that the world faces, is that the post-war institutions which we established to try and uphold the peace and avoid the worst abuses of the first half of the 20th century, they're coming under immense stress. And whether it's the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights, or the ICC, the World Trade Organization, its dispute resolution mechanism, or indeed the World Health Organization, all of these institutions are now being fundamentally challenged. And it's not a good thing. These institutions are important. And if we're not going to uphold the rulings of the ICC, that fundamentally undermines it. And the implications are pretty straightforward. If we believe in the court and Netanyahu comes here, he'll have to be arrested. Now, that is a major political decision. It will cause outrage, even that I've said it. But what people need to do is just detach from the moment and say, hang on, what are these institutions for? Why were they established? And what kind of future do we want to live in? Because I'm afraid there are a large number of people in this country who do, and I'm afraid it will outrage some of your viewers, there are a large proportion of people in this country who think that it is a genocide in certain sections of our communities.
I don't want to, punch old bruises or anything, but we've had a long debate about leaving multinational institutions. If you don't agree with it, you don't want to do the thing that does, you've got to leave, haven't you?
I'm afraid so, yes, probably yes, or reform it. But so, for example, on the Convention and migration, a number of countries have the same problems we have with illegal migration. It ought to be possible to amend the European Convention on Human Rights, or rather amend the jurisprudence, do something to agree to treaty changes which constrain the jurisprudence, because the Convention itself is perfectly straightforward and sensible. But it ought to be possible to have reform.
Joe?
I mean, why do we have the ICC? And I mean, war is, on one level always horrendous, but equally, even within the horrors of war, we recognise that there are some lines that you draw. There are war crimes which are legally defined, and that is a line by which, even when you're engaging in warfare, you should not cross. And the ICC, for all of its imperfections, is the institution that we have to be able to try to give some meaning to those rules that we create. And when you're talking as they are, I mean, it really just underscores the horror of what is going on in Gaza when they're talking about how starvation should not be used as a weapon of war. So we do have to uphold it. We do want the situation, as you say, you get the hostages back, you stop the horrendous violence, but we have to uphold those institutions.
If I may, I agree with a lot of what Joe said. I didn't disagree anywhere. But what I would just say is I listened to Netanyahu's recent rebuttal, and he did point out that Israel sent a large amount of food into Gaza. The sort of thing that comes up is, did they turn off the water into Gaza? Because turning off the water, that is too much. That's too far.
What does the occupying power do? But let's stick with the ICC issue, James. What would you have said about this? It's an awkward one for government, isn't it?
Well, it is hypothetical. He's not going to come. He's certainly not going to be invited. And it is a complicated legal process. So I think were I still in government, you would probably say that it's a hypothetical situation and the law would have to take its course. Having said that, clearly Israel has a right to defend itself. The hostages should be returned. 7th of October was absolutely horrific. But there have been far too many deaths. The violence has been excessive in terms of casualties on the other side. And in a way, more important than what the government will do is getting to a ceasefire and stopping the suffering on both sides. The politics feels a little bit less important, frankly, than the reality on the ground. given that Netanyahu isn't going to be coming here anytime soon.
Let's go back to domestic politics. It's pretty early to get the contours of the new Conservative Party. The two things that we know that the new leader doesn't like are the VAT on private school fees and the inheritance tax changes in relation specifically to farming properties. Joe, this sort of, I was trying to put to Kevin Holloway, this feels like, in a way, the old Tories defending a particular set of interests. Am I going a bit far here?
Well, I mean, you can certainly interpret it like that. I mean, I think it probably also would perhaps be more surprising if the Conservatives were like backing up the Conservatives on this. If you think about this from the kind of politics of opposition, you know, you've got constituencies of people there who are angry about what's happening. You know, in a sense, it's perhaps then not massively surprising that those are being opposed. Yeah. Even though in a set of difficult circumstances, there's obviously a strong argument for people who have broader shoulders carrying more of the tax increases that are necessary.
Steve, I'm frankly, this is great stuff for us. Bit of class war, Tories defending the middle classes, Labour getting after them. Isn't this what politics should be about?
Well, it's slightly comical. I mean, if the Conservative Party does revert to just defending the landed interests, then obviously it is, in fact, finished. But, I'm from a working-class background, and I think the Conservative Party
You're going to say the word, aren't you?
I am. My granddad was a toolmaker. Yeah, he's also a good socialist. But, my father was a building site carpenter, and my stepfather, after divorce, was an open-cast mine worker. So I think I can reasonably claim to come from a working-class background. But class, really, I do think is something we should transcend. We never have. We probably never will. But, yeah, I mean, the party's finished if it just defends the landed interest.
Yeah, it's a long way from hug a hoodie or, going around polar areas on Huskies. It would have been a really interesting position, actually, for the Tories to support this. And I think...
It'd be wrong.
But to your point, I think it is interesting that they've actually taken positions on this. They could be echoing the sentiment, raising questions, but it's maybe where you start in a parliament and you try to sort of bolster your core vote. It's probably not how you win. To win, you have to get to those floating voters.
Taxing capital to pay for current spending is like burning the furniture to keep warm. It's wrong. It should be stopped.
Frankly, I just want straight, all-out class war. But anyway, never mind. Next, we're going to speak live to Kim Leadbeater, the Labour MP introducing that assisted dying legislation that we've been talking about this morning.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here.
In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes,
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
This conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Let's return now to the assisted dying legislation that will be voted on by MPs next Friday. Both the Justice and Health Secretaries, the key ministers responsible for the issue, are now openly opposed to changing the law. But polls consistently say the public are strongly in favour. So is the proposal the right way to bring in such fundamental change to this country? And is the government now effectively opposed to it? The MP introducing the bill, Kim Leadbeater, joins us now. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning, Trevor.
How do you respond to the Justice Secretary's accusation this morning that your bill would put us on the slippery slope to what she calls death on demand?
Look, I've got a huge amount of respect for Shabana. She's a very good colleague and a good friend. It's absolutely right that this is a free vote. It's a vote of conscience, and you've had members of different political parties on your show this morning saying how they will vote, and that's absolutely the right thing. But look, in terms of the concept of a slippery slope, the title of the bill is very, very clear. It is called Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill. It cannot include anybody other than people who are terminally ill with a number of months of their life left to live. It very clearly states that the bill will not cover anybody else other than people in that category. So I think that's the first point. And in our country, Parliament is sovereign. So once this law is passed, it cannot be changed. So I think we just need to be really clear about the people that the bill will cover. And I can't even begin to tell you the number of stories, the number of emails, the number of people who have stopped me in the street to tell me of their really traumatic, harrowing stories, which clearly show that the law and the legal framework at the moment just simply doesn't exist to support people. And then we have the concept of the choice at the end of life, which is something I firmly believe in, and Liz Kendall was making those comments earlier on. There's a clear problem here, and we need to fix it. And as legislators, I believe we have a duty to do that.
I want to come to some of the technical objections, but let's just start with, if you like, the broad argument. For example, many disability activists make the case that simply debating this topic in this way means that their lives come to be regarded as expendable. Do you understand that?
Well, I respectfully disagree with that. What I would actually say is quite the opposite. Isn't it brilliant that we're talking about the rights of disabled people? And I've met with a number of disability rights activists, and I've said to them, look, I will support you in your campaign for better rights for disabled people every single day. And that campaign must continue whatever happens with this bill. But it's very clear that this bill is about dying people. It's not about disabled people. And whilst I will fight for the rights of those with disabilities, I will also fight for the rights of terminally ill people who are dying. So let's keep that conversation going. So I actually think it's given a platform to have that conversation. And I'm meeting with Tanni Gray-Thompson next week to talk about that issue. So they are both very important issues, but I would suggest that they are separate campaigns and we should be fighting both of these campaigns alongside each other.
Tanni Gray-Thompson, the Paralympic athlete who is actually a member of the House of Lords, we've talked to her about this before. There's another issue, I think, that's been arising today, and that is the manner in which this debate is held. Part of the issue has been, should cabinet ministers play a part and so on, but I want to ask you about the terms in which, I guess, the participants address each other. Your colleague, Charlie Faulkner, has this morning said that he thinks that Shabana Mahmood is wrong, and he attributes her view essentially to religious belief in the sanctity of life. I'm sure that is indeed, from her letter, part of what she believes, but she also objects to the legislation on practical grounds. And I suppose the question is really, is that helpful to you in a way to characterise your opponents in that way?
Look, I set out very clearly when I chose to put this bill forward to try and ensure that we have a very robust debate on this hugely important subject, but also we are respectful and we are compassionate throughout that debate. And I would say that for the main part, that has been the case. But equally, people do hold really strong views on this subject, so they will speak passionately and they will disagree. I've spent a lot of time over the last sort of 8.5 years looking at ways that we can disagree well. And I think for the main part that has happened, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be very clear about our strong views. And I understand, Charlie Faulkner's campaigned on this issue for a long time. He feels really strongly about it. And the point about religion does come into this debate. We have to be honest about that. There are people who would never support a change in the law because of their religious beliefs. Equally, within faith communities, there are a range of opinions. I met with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, who feels very strongly that the law needs to change, as does Rabbi Jonathan Romain. So I think it's important that we consider people's belief systems as part of this debate, but we do that respectfully. And we acknowledge that people of different faiths also actually have different opinions on this issue.
The other question I think that's being raised by some people is the question of why now? Gordon Brown, for example, who has come out against it on the grounds of he thinks that there aren't enough safeguards against coercion of vulnerable people. But he suggests that we need to take longer. There needs to be a different sort of debate, a wider debate. Why push this through now?
Well, again, Gordon Brown is someone I have a huge amount of respect for, and I respect his opinion on this, but I do disagree with him. And I also disagree with the concept of pushing this through. That isn't what's happening here. This debate has been going on for decades, and we've now got 31 jurisdictions around the world where there is some form of assisted dying. We have the benefit of learning from the practice which we would want to potentially emulate in this country, and certain practices which we would absolutely not want to emulate in this country. So this is not a new subject. And I would say to MP colleagues, anybody who came into Parliament this time thinking this conversation wasn't going to happen must have been hiding away somewhere, because we knew that this was one of the issues that was probably going to become before Parliament. So I think now is the time for the conversation. And if we look at the public polling on this subject, there was a recent YouGov poll just last week which suggests that 73% of people think the law should change. There's been more polling this weekend. Our duty as parliamentarians is to represent the public mood and is to listen to our constituents and listen to what the people of our country feel about issues. And that's why this debate, I think, does need to take place now. And the time feels very much right for it. And indeed, I would firmly stand by that we also do need a change in the law.
Can I ask you, just finally, one, I guess, personal question, really. Do you have doubts? Do you wake up in the morning and think to myself, what if I'm wrong and my legislation leads to people who don't really want to die taking their own lives?
No, I don't have any doubts whatsoever. I wouldn't have put the bill forward if I did. What I'm very clear about is we have got people now who the law is failing. We have got people taking their own lives. We have got families losing loved ones in very harrowing circumstances. And we have got people having very painful deaths. I've just had another email coming through, and I've had hundreds, thousands probably now actually, of someone who's a surgeon who has seen horrible deaths of people who've got incurable and inoperable cancers. So there is a very clear problem that needs to be solved. And actually, by creating a legal framework, we will improve the situation. If you assist someone, whether that's by going to another country for an assisted death, or if you are involved in someone taking their own life, one of your loved ones who really cannot cope with the fear or the pain of what their end of life looks like, you can be prosecuted and you can go to prison. People live in fear under those circumstances. That cannot be right. So we've got a duty to fix this problem. Now, the safeguards in this bill will be the most robust in the world. There are layers and layers of safeguarding within the bill. We make coercion a criminal offence. Do you know when we check for coercion now when someone takes their own life? Yes. When they're dead. And it's a little bit late then. So there's a very clear problem for me that needs to be solved.
Kim Leadbeater, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Next, voters go to the polls in Ireland in just 5 days' time. In a few moments, we'll bring you an interview with the man who hopes he'll stay as Prime Minister.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
In just 5 days' time, Ireland will vote in a general election. If you'd looked at the polls this time last year, you'd think Sinn Féin might be heading for an historic win, taking control both south and north of the border on the island. Now it's too close to call between Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and the party of the current Prime Minister, Fine Gael. Our senior Ireland correspondent David Blevins is speaking to all three of the contenders to take the top job for Sky News this coming week. First is the Taoiseach Simon Harris for this programme.
Simon Harris, you were Taoiseach Prime Minister at the age of 37, a Cabinet Minister aged 29, a TD Member of Parliament at 24. But all over the Western world, electorates are rejecting career politicians. So why should they vote for you?
Well, I'd ask people to vote for me based on the plan that we have for our country for the next number of years, and I'd make the point that political experience is a positive and not a negative. We live in a very uncertain world. It's become even more uncertain in the last number of weeks. I got involved in politics at a young age, as you rightly say, but I got involved at a young age for a very specific reason of advocacy. When I had a brother born with autism and wanted to start campaigning for better facilities for people with autism, and found myself somewhat drawn into or sucked into politics at that young age. But since then I've had a number of leadership roles that I believe have prepared me well for the position of Taoiseach. And of course I've only had the opportunity to be Taoiseach of Ireland for the last 7 months, and I'm asking people to give me a mandate now for the next 5 years so that I can implement the plans we have around cost of living, childcare, housing and helping small businesses.
You've only been Taoiseach for 7 months, but your party Fine Gael has been in office since 2011. This would be an historic 4th consecutive term. Is there a danger of a party becoming complacent if it never serves time in opposition?
Well, my party is anything but complacent, and I suppose what I would say is during that 14 years, it hasn't been a static period of time, of course. During that 14 years, we've been dealing with the financial crisis. First thing my party had to do was get the IMF out of town and restore our economic sovereignty as quickly as possible. Secondly, we had Brexit, and viewers in Sky News will remember that, the challenges that posed for peace process and for our livelihoods and for relationships between these two islands. Then we had a COVID pandemic, saving lives and livelihoods, and then an inflationary crisis. And my party has played a part in government during all of that time, but in very different governments with different levels of relative strength in the governments during those years. But I'm in politics long enough, despite my relative youth, to know politics is always about the future. And very much as I travel around this country, people are asking about what can you do for the next 5 years to secure our future at a very difficult time in the world.
Okay, let's talk a little about the immediate future then. Fianna Fáil is your only realistic coalition partner if you hope to get back into government. So why are you attacking their policies?
So my party's worked very well with Fianna Fáil. I think Fianna Fáil have worked well with Fine Gael. We've worked well in a 3-party coalition. I'm proud to lead that 3-party coalition. But we did, all 3 parties, make a decision to contest the election as independent parties, as standalone parties. And of course, that means we put forward policy ideas. It's been the first election I've been in as a leader to put forward a policy agenda. And I think it's good to tease through and debate policies, to debate economic policy, to debate different perspectives on different issues. But I'm not going to airbrush the past. I'm very proud of the work of the coalition government. But my job right now is to outline my vision to the people of this country and ask them to vote for it.
The median age at which someone buys a house in Ireland is 39. By coincidence, that's almost your age. So you're of the generation whose earnings have failed to keep pace with the growth of house prices. But the difference is you're the man in charge. So what do you say to people about that?
I'm the man in charge for 7 months, but I am the man in charge, and I'm the person in charge, and I'm the person determined to fix the housing crisis for once and for all. And what I say to those young people right across Ireland, and I say it to them directly on the stump at the moment, is we now finally have 2 things in Ireland to fix the housing crisis: the money and the plan. It's rare over the last several years that we've had both at the same time. My party, Fine Gael, has published a plan now to build 303,000 homes over the next 5 years. And we've also put in place a number of supports for first-time buyers. There's a debate in our election about those supports, but I'm absolutely determined to keep those financial supports in place for first-time buyers for one reason and one reason only. We have to bridge the gap while we build up housing supply to help people get their foot on the ladder.
You've talked about the money. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk first about immigration, another big issue in this election. When the coalition came to power, immigration was less than 100,000 per year. It's now more than 150,000 per year. Now, the figure for asylum seekers was under 4,000, and it now stands at 33,000. Your government really lost control of that issue, didn't it?
So in our country, respectfully, we don't use that sort of language around migration debates. I mean, we live in a European Union. We're very proud to be in the European Union, and we have seen a war on the continent of Europe. My country, Ireland, has played a role in assisting 106,000 people from Ukraine fleeing Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. That has been an important factor. We've also seen, not just in Ireland, but across the EU and indeed in the UK, a very significant increase in migration movements. What my government has had to do is this, for the very first time, really build up migration structures and policies and processes in a way that wasn't, frankly, a major political issue in Ireland before. This is probably the first general election in which immigration is on the political agenda in terms of a debating point, and that is a good thing. I'm very clear we need to have a fair but firmer approach to migration, and I've made a number of changes over the last few months since taking on the office of Taoiseach to make sure that rules are tighter, to make sure that rules are applied when it comes to things like processing times, deportation orders, and indeed I have a number of other proposals now in terms of making sure that anyone who comes to Ireland who has a financial income is paying a contribution towards their costs here too.
Taoiseach, do you think President Trump means what he says when he talks about imposing tariffs on imports from the EU and attracting big US multinationals back from Ireland?
I think President Trump does mean what he says in terms of his position in relation to trade and tariffs. And I think President Trump has received a very large mandate in terms of the outcome of the US presidential election. And I do, being very honest, think that the second Trump presidency may not be comparable to the first. For a variety of reasons, including that increased mandate that he's now received, including looking at some of the key appointments that he's making to his cabinet in terms of the direction of trade. And that's why I'm preparing my country and working with EU counterparts to prepare the EU for that changed reality we may see. Now, Ireland can approach this with confidence. There are many reasons firms locate in Ireland, including our access to the European Union. But also we can never be complacent. And that's why my party is setting aside a very significant amount into funds, future funds, to protect our country from any economic shock. And I think President-elect Trump is a businessman. He is transactional in many ways. He approaches the world through the lens of a businessman. And we will be making the point that Irish companies are now creating jobs in every US state, and that actually trade between the US and Ireland and trade between the US and the EU is good, not just for people in the EU and Ireland, but is also good for people who voted for President Trump.
Taoiseach, traditionally Fine Gael supports low public spending and free markets. But like most of your opponents, you seem to be competing to spend money in this election campaign. You're campaigning on energy bill reductions, pension increases, family care increases, child benefit increases, rent tax credits and €1,000 for every baby born in Ireland. The last Celtic Tiger led to a crash. Do you ever pause to think about the fact that this one could too?
Oh, nobody in Ireland needs to pause in relation to remembering how my political predecessors destroyed our economy and crashed it. We know we live with the scars every single day in terms of trying to get public services back to where they need to, trying to make up for that lost decades, trying to get up housing supply. Nobody needs to pause or be reminded in relation to that. We lived through that. But it's exactly for that reason that my party is approaching the election looking to do three things. Help people in the here and now, because the cost of living crisis is real. Invest in our public services, our infrastructure, which is key to our economic success as well as social cohesion. But thirdly and crucially, also set aside billions of euro every year into funds to provide a buffer so that my children never experience the austerity that my generation did.
The last Fine Gael Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has said that the next Irish government must work actively towards a united Ireland. Is he right? It doesn't appear to be an issue in your campaign.
Well, let me be very clear. I have an aspiration to see a united Ireland. My party's full title is Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party, and it is a legitimate aspiration, and probably has been the aspiration of anyone who's ever held the office that I held, to see our island and our country united. That is my aspiration. But I also want to be honest with the people of Ireland and indeed with the people of the UK. My priority right now is working to fulfil and harness the potential of the Good Friday Agreement, which has seen too much of a stop and a start. We now have the institutions back up and running in Northern Ireland. We have an interlocutor in Downing Street in Prime Minister Starmer, and I would believe an interlocutor in government buildings in Dublin. all three wanting to work together to make sure that not just the peace part of the Good Friday Agreement, vital as it is secured, but also the prosperity agenda. And I have worked intensively with Keir Starmer and others to see that reset in Anglo-Irish relations. We've agreed structures now where you'll have an Irish-UK summit each year where our ministers will work to an agreed programme of joint areas of interest. We have a shared island unit, which I'm committed to keeping here in this jurisdiction to work and support projects on an all-island basis. There is much work to do, but you unite people not by arbitrary dates or deadlines for polls. You unite people by winning hearts and minds.
You're a relatively young man. Do you expect to see it in your lifetime?
I think it's entirely possible to see it in my lifetime, but I'm not yet ready to put deadlines on these things, because I think when you do, I think you drive people further away rather than closer together.
Simon Harris, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David.
Simon Harris there, and a reminder that David Blevins is speaking to all three of the contenders for the top job in Ireland. You can catch the interviews with the leaders of Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil on Politics Hub on Sky News over the next 2 days. In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts watching us live.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place and all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Is it a draw? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else.
It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Are you diminished by claims that you're a racist?
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
The most significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
You want to jump in a normal life?
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Back to our panel, James Purnell, Steve Baker and Joe Swinson. Let's start I suppose, where you should, which is in a democracy, public view about this. The public is pretty clear. 2/3 support legalising. And in fact, if we break it down, what we find is that the opposition, most of it is practical rather than principle, that they think safeguards aren't quite there. And what I'm very struck by myself is how sustained this view has been. Looking back to 2015, last time we looked at it, 80% plus supported change. Joe, how much should this weigh with MPs?
I think it will weigh to an extent. I mean, I never had to, in my time in Parliament, vote on assisted dying. But I do remember, actually, I had a kind of panel of constituents where I would email people, you know, different issues and questions and try and, you know, with kind of for and against kind of selections of articles. And I remember, I think I did once do the topic of assisted dying, and it was similar that lots of people were in favour. But I think the other thing is you know, it is also just something where, particularly in a free vote, you just feel such a sense of responsibility on an issue that is literally life and death, that I would be surprised if many MPs basically just sort of subcontracted that to their constituents and said, well, like, my constituents want this. I think most MPs will be listening, engaging. And I think it is one of those examples where actually, you know, next Friday when this is discussed, I would expect the House of Commons to be a very good place for debate, because it can do that at times.
Yes. I think that's right. And, you know, most of the time you're whipped. So when you get a vote like this, where you're making up your individual mind, you get to work with people from different parties, people you don't necessarily always agree with. So I think people would take it seriously. I'm not sure how much the overall public opinion would, you know, what difference that would make to people. I think potentially, as you say, people you talk to regularly, local faith groups, local doctors, solicitors, that might make a difference. But I think this is something people will take pretty seriously.
Yeah, I wonder if you guys would agree with me that the vast majority of constituents in any constituency probably haven't expressed a view to their MP. Yes. So the polls only take you so far, yes. But most constituents won't have sent an email, and probably, quite honestly, thank God, because you can't reply to them all.
But also, you're not going to get re-elected based on this. No. You know, you're going to get re-elected on much wider factors than how your party's doing. So yeah. I don't think people will overcalculate this one.
Except possibly in a small number of constituencies where the composition of the constituency is such that this really matters. One of the underlying things in this poll, which is, we haven't got the graphic for it, but it shows that there are about half a dozen constituencies where a majority opposed the bill, and that's half a dozen in the whole country, that's all. But they're all constituencies which, frankly, have a large group of Muslim voters amongst them. And I suspect that view is what Shabana Mahmood is reflecting, because hers is one of them.
That's probably the case, yeah. I mean, certainly in Wickham, which is about a fifth British Muslims and very strong Christian communities, Sikhs too, increasingly Hindus as well, but with a very large Muslim population. I've absolutely no doubt that Emma Reynolds' postbag will be dominated by people who are against, yes.
And of course, this is quite a tricky issue for British politics. We don't, as Alistair Campbell once famously said, we don't do God. But actually, for a lot of people, this is literally about God. Is it God or is it us who have dominion, the word that Hollingray used earlier on?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it reminds me a little bit, one of the controversial issues which I did have to vote on was the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Bill. I don't know if you remember that, James. I'm pretty sure it was in the 2005-2010 Parliament. And it was, I mean, it was at the time, I think, the biggest issue in my postbag ever. Like, I had more than 600 people get in touch about it. And there was lots and lots of different clauses and different elements of, you know, experimentation on embryos and so on. And I think in the end, though, I ended up probably disappointing quite a lot of people, because most of my postbag was basically very heavily against. And I ended up, you know, like voting a different way on some of the different issues, because I didn't have that sort of wonderful certainty of thinking, well, this is absolutely just always wrong. I was really trying to weigh up the kind of moral things on each element. But what I would say is I responded to people with exactly why I had voted on each of the things. It was one of the longest ever letters I sent back, right? But people really loved that I did that. Right, because I think actually they want to know that their MPs are thinking about it.
This is very interesting. You know, free votes don't come along very often, but it is striking that actually we all remember these as issues that people think about: smoking ban, fox hunting, Fluoride to water, I'd almost forgotten that. Should Parliament do more of this, actually?
Yes.
It feels like this has engaged the public in a way that most politics does not.
You compare it to America, where all legislation is initiated by members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. You know, the fact that Kim has come on top here in this bill means that she's able to drive this. It does feel, I don't want to go anywhere near the American system, but it does feel like potentially there could be a little bit more. But I guess it's maybe also interesting to think about what's good about this, and it's a way of people being able to debate the issues which don't come up so naturally through party politics. If it had been, you know, Tory versus Conservative or Lib Dem, probably you wouldn't be having this debate. And I think as we sort of think about the vote on Friday, actually, if people are hesitating, this is probably a moment to say, well, this is the vote of principle. Let's let it go through, see if I have got some questions about the practicalities, see if they're addressed in committee. And then it's at the third reading, when it comes back, having been there, having been to the Lords, it's at the third reading that you can say, right, OK, my concerns haven't been addressed.
I'm sorry, that's really... that sounds so persuasive from James, and of course it does, and some MPs will think like that. But there's a really important psychological phenomenon which applies to particularly war and peace votes as well. Once you've voted for a thing, there's a great deal of momentum to stay consistent to the way you've voted. So although I'm not saying James is wrong, it's just that for many people, once they've voted for something at second reading, they'll naturally maintain the momentum, partly because they'll have alienated a good proportion of their voters. So why alienate the other half?
We've got less than a minute to go, so 10 seconds each. If you were back in the House, what would you do?
I think that in principle, I'm broadly in favour, but I have those concerns that James mentioned that I would really want to understand at the later stages.
I'd be disposed to vote against like I did before, but I promised my electors I'd listen carefully because the argument on human agency is so very strong.
I'd vote in favour.
This didn't come up before when you were in the House?
No, but I mean, my family knows someone who starved themselves to death, and I just think at the moment the system just isn't protecting people from that. I think it's much better to have rules out in the open.
Well, thank you all very much. This is a slightly different kind of programme, but all the better for that in some ways, I think. That's it for this week's show. I'll be back next Sunday when we'll know what Parliament has decided. Watch Sophie all this week. See you next Sunday.